Hey guys, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna Bemis Palmer Museum in York, Nebraska. So for this week's episode, we're going to be talking about musical instruments that were played during the Civil War. So there were a lot of different instruments that were played during this time. There were fifes and bagpipes and bugles, but today we're going to focus specifically on drums. And later in this episode, I'm going to show you a drum that we have in our collection that was played in what is noted as the bloodiest battle in the entire Civil War. So when you think of the Civil War, the first thing that comes to mind is probably not drums or anything having to do with musical instruments. And there's a lot of different questions that I've come across in my research about why were drums played in battle? What's their significance? Why are people just not holding rifles? Isn't it dangerous to be there playing the drums? And I figured I'd answer some of those questions today. So, were there people designated as drummers? Yes, there were people designated as drummers. And actually, the thing about being a drummer is there was no age restriction to play a drum in the Civil War. So a lot of young men who were too young to fight in physical battle signed up to play a drum so that they were still a part of the Civil War and a part of the army, but yet far enough away from battle that it was supposedly safe. Due to this no age restriction, a lot of the photos that you see of Civil War musicians are of really young guys. Now, that's not to be said that every single musician was a teenager. There were also older guys that played in battle, and they chose to play because they didn't physically want to fight, or maybe they couldn't physically fight. Now, if the goal was to avoid fighting, not every single person was successful. A lot of times, the guys that played the drums actually got called on to carry around stretchers or administer first aid. And actually, some even voluntarily joined into the fight itself. One such guy was a guy named George Palmer. He was from the 1st Cavalry out of Illinois, and he received a Medal of Honor for picking up a rifle and helping to reclaim a hospital that was overrun in the Battle of Lexington. Aside from George Palmer, there were actually 27 other musicians who also received Medal of Honor awards for similar acts of bravery. Another question I come across is, how were drums beneficial to the war? Like, why? Just why? Why are you playing drums in a battle? I think a lot of confusion lies around this question, and there are a lot of reasons that just maybe aren't obvious. Now, one thing that happened when you're playing drums is you're actually communicating orders. So depending on the different rhythms that they played, they could be code for different things. Some things were as simple as waking an army up, but other things that were more complex were things like advancing or retreating. And the nice thing about being able to play drums is you didn't have to gather to hear the orders. You could be spread out over a large lay of land, and you were able to figure out, oh, well, this is what I'm supposed to do next because I heard this specific rhythm. Now, they were also a great motivator in the fight. I know for me personally, when I'm listening to music, it keeps me focused and on task, and then I want to finish what I'm doing. So this is similar in that you had that motivation, you had that backing, and it really led to the unity factor as well, that you weren't alone. You could hear the music, you could see the people, and it was a whole experience. You could also bring fear to the enemy and actually fool an opposing army into thinking that your army was bigger, depending on the amount of drums that you had behind you. These drums weren't just played in battles, they were also played at camp and in funerals. So what kind of drums were used? Somewhere around 40,000 men played drums in the Civil War, so there wasn't a standard, this is your drum. There are a lot of different types that were used. Most of them were made out of maple or ash or holly, and they could be decorated however you wanted to decorate them. So if you were in the Union Army, you usually had an eagle on it, not mandatory, but was an option. If you were in the Confederate Army, you usually had the Confederate like the shield. You could have a colored drum. Usually if you had one that was blue, it meant that you were with the infantry, or if you had one that was red, it usually meant that you were in the artillery. Again, not mandatory, but was an option there. So another question we get is, did you need any special training to play? The quick answer is no. A lot of men showed up to play drums that did not read music or could not read music. And as you can imagine, that led to a lot of disorganization. A lot of people that were playing that didn't know what they were doing could communicate the wrong signals, and also it could come off as noise to the soldier if it's too discombobulated. This could lead to a lot of mass confusion and also could be a liability if it were to happen in battle. There were schools that offered classes, but most of the guys just learned on the field, and luckily you got plenty of practice as the drums were heard frequently on the battlefield, and so you had plenty of time to improve. So are there any famous drummers? As mentioned, there was George Palmer and the other people that won the Medal of Honor. Another name that you may know is Patrick Gilmore. He was part of the 24th Massachusetts. He's known for writing the song When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and that became kind of an anthem in its own right during the Civil War. You heard it quite frequently. Some other names you might know are Charles King, who was a 13-year-old, and it is thought that he was the youngest casualty in the entire Civil War. So he was part of the 29th Pennsylvania, and he was wounded at the Battle of Antietam. They carried him off to the hospital, but he still died 3 days later. There's also John Clem, who joined at the age of 9. So they said that when a Confederate soldier ordered him to surrender, he actually picked up a rifle and shot him at the age of 9. Another name you may know is Alexander H. Johnson. So he was the first African-American musician to enlist. He was part of the 54th Massachusetts, and he was under the direction of Colonel Robert Shaw. So the regiment was one of the first regiments of African-American soldiers, and the story surrounding him is that when this unit left Boston, they were marching out of Boston, he and the colonel were marching at the front of the group. Now, Colonel Shaw died in battle, but Johnson actually lived until the end of the war and actually went on to serve during Sherman's march. In 1897, a sculpture was dedicated to them depicting Colonel Shaw marching his men out of Boston, and in the sculpture there is a drummer boy right at the front, and it's said to have a resounding resemblance to Johnson, which I think was pretty cool. So now we're going to go take a look at the drum that we have in our collection. So this field drum was donated by C.I. Brewer, and it was played by his grandfather, John Jason Brewer, who was a member of the Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg. So the really neat thing is that this drum was handed down through generations, and the donor, C.I. Brewer, actually played the drum in his high school band in Alma, Nebraska in 1914. Taking a closer look, you can see the string that goes around, and if you look even closer, you'll see stars and eagles' wings there on the side, depicting it was definitely a drum from the Union Army. In this case, you'll see other musical instruments as well, and other drum items that we have are this framed photo of the National Association of Civil War Musicians, donated by the Grand Army of the Republic. Many of their members are depicted in it, holding their musical instruments. And also, we have this photo of the Nebraska division of the Civil War musicians as well, with many locals there standing with their instruments. So those are just a few items that we have in our collection regarding drums in the Civil War. If you haven't come to visit us yet, we're open Tuesdays through Fridays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. If you're unavailable to come out during those hours, reach out to us through our website, palmermuseum.com, and set up a private tour. If you have any questions regarding what we talked about today, hit me up in the comments section.